Hello everyone, this is the Shientist, and I'm gonna today give an overview of a topic and subject entity linked with the last audio and podcast, which was about how to be an effective collaborator, or how to have effective collaborations. This audio podcast, as part of the LabZtorm Effect series, is going to be around interprofessional collaborations. And This is the Shientist, and it's another Storm Lobostics production. I'm gonna sort of put this context into different sort of sections. A bit of introduction around the subject, some context about the history of science and medicine, and then some aspects around interprofessional working, or and sort of how aspects of that context relates to patients and health sort of patients going through different long-term conditions, and then more and then that there will be then a focus of linking that into interprofessional collaborations, and there will be a section in this audio around a sort of professional integration, so where basically medicine and healthcare isn't just about frontline, it's also about capturing the understanding and aspects of healthcare as from health professionals who may not necessarily be patient-facing health professionals. And so with this, I will give just a few authors, names of some authors who have published around some of the things, the entities that will be discussed in this audio, and listeners are more than welcome to check them out at their own time, or in at their own at their own time. So to begin with, I'm going to give a sort of an introduction to this topic. So most of the health professional groups and those working in health in areas of healthcare, and around patients, or those going through sort of long-term condition, and long-term condition, and potentially healthcare health inabilities and compromised health. They will have a focus in between health sectors, and two main health sectors, being primary care, or in community, or where patients, for example, might see for example, a family physician or a GP or someone like that, at least traditionally, in a traditional sense, and then in secondary care, which is basically, at least in the UK, it is basically where health professionals practice and provide healthcare provision and services is part of being part of a working team or member of the team in the hospital setting. Health professionals, I'm sure listeners would know and are probably aware as well that health professionals also work in other areas of practice, including research in the commercial sectors, in the pharmaceutical industries, and other areas. So it's not so as not to be so restrictive to those particular initial healthcare sectors, but primarily this sort of understanding is going to come from sort of be in and around the understanding around those two health sectors. Now, from that. Also, I'm going to, as I have done in previous audios and podcasts, I've highlighted context related to mainly around healthcare, health service, healthcare services, and maybe healthcare research. So I'm going to give a perspective from that, and I will use the context around chronic kidney disease as a focal point relating to and pertaining to a long-term condition. Now, considering patients have a lot more involvement in aspects of healthcare and decision making, having access to different sorts of health professionals, or those who make up a part of the multidisciplinary team, or also known as and referred to as allied health professionals, or AHPs. Having access to them could, depending on, of course, different kinds of scenarios, could help shape the future of aspects of health, and potentially aspects of service and reform. Patients with long-term conditions like chronic kidney disease, or where healthcare relates around the specialty that is to do with kidney care practice, also known as nephrology, not only need to have that sort of access to different professionals at the appropriate times, for example, but those who are in and around providing service and are part of service provision, they should be able to provide and offer sort of educational support, as well as in addition to the practical elements of healthcare. At present, patients are increasingly seeking such understanding, and this should not be a surprise in any way, and that is to say that patients with particular long-term conditions apart from getting some underlying basis of what's going on with them, for example, from one of their health service providers or professionals that they health professionals that they might see, the 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 sort of go-to focus first and foremost is probably checking out things entity, or trying to grasp areas and focuses around what might be going on with them through maybe an internet search, for example. And so whilst that's been increasing, and it shouldn't be a surprise, there are obvious advantages and disadvantages around that. Patients can become empowered quite succinctly when they identify answers to particular issues and concerns around their healthcare. But the disadvantage is that it can lead to a bit of potentially problems where they can get quite overwhelmed by some of the information that they might read, or understanding they might take from an internet search, or at least initially. And also there could be context that comes out of an initial internet search, and so that actually what then happens is that they get they can not just get overwhelmed or become overwhelmed, they can also get misinformed, and it can lead to misinformed and misinformation more generally around aspects of their healthcare, and thus takes us, and that takes us to where we have been for quite some time, and that is to the point where patients, whatever the question or query or inquiry might be, go directly to their health professional, and it would be a frontline healthcare professional, which is on the one hand an appropriate kind of step to get answers, but those health professionals are have their own time incapacities as well. So at present, patients are doing that, and also there are online support groups, and there are sort of online spaces, there are online forums, and there are sort of websites and sort of educational portals, or sort of apps and things like that that can actually be quite helpful. And that context has come out from a paper publication by Christensen and Sue in 2013, and without sort of appropriate baseline or evidence-based understanding or education or guidance, patients not just become overwhelmed, or can and where they can where that can also lead to misinformation, but it also compromises health from a health and healthcare from a sort of an absolute perspective, but and also compromises sort of that relationship between the patient and the professional, but and also, and this is probably the one focus that that I'm particularly interested in, and that is around where the sort of the research and the sort of literacy and that aspect also causes patients don't actually become empowered, and they can't take ownership, because the understanding around certain aspects of their healthcare are just opportunity, really, just where they are approaching health professionals directly, and actually what should be sort of bi-directional aspect of healthcare. They actually it becomes sort of a single direction basically the healthcare professional provides the understanding and aspect around healthcare, whatever that might be, and the patient is basically none the wiser. They basically do as the professional says, and whilst there's every patient going through an aspect of health, going through aspects of healthcare, they are to listen to they can obviously, and they should listen to the health professionals, and but at the same time they're not they may have anxieties about asking specific questions, and that listeners, is where there's a problem, because this is where patients going through aspects of healthcare, generally speaking, across the board, really, their health literacy level and how they interact with aspects of healthcare more generally, the integrity is lost, and the literacy generally is not a focus, and it hasn't been really, and this is when professionals generally can find themselves struggling with their sort of case files, because they get, for example, a patient sort of bringing up the same inquiry or health ailment or complaint more frequently than actually sort of having an appropriate route to supporting that area of health or healthcare, so that the patient can actually, take a lead on that issue. So so guidance and sort of the educational element is and has always been and should be the first and foremost aspect. Nowadays, you will all be aware there's lots of different sort of technologies out there, and that can actually be somewhat mind-numbing. It actually, whilst some of those things can help to empower patients, they actually don't question aspects of healthcare, and then that is why, for example, some patients have, for example, a sort of good practice, let's say, in aspects of their health or healthcare, versus what should be best practice or practice in excellence from health professionals. So this is some that's some sort of an overview of in relating to an introduction. I'm now going to talk a little bit about the history of science and medicine. So it's kind of a link between what's been sort of raised as part of as part of the introduction, but also there will be sort of an understanding really about how retrospectively things have kind of sort of stayed in on the one hand stayed or have been interconnected, but also on another side there's been some areas of healthcare that have been compromised, and there's been some areas that have also focuses where in healthcare and even in healthcare research, for example, there has been disconnect in aligning what is coming out in practice and also in relating to patients sort of having an understanding and taking ownership and becoming more empowered. So the relationship between science and medicine sort of can be traced back to early 19th century. Historians have highlighted a great sort of a sort of a transformation actually took place around the 19th century when some of the physiologists when some of the physiologists and those in so areas of medicine and areas of science, for example, in microbiology and focusing and linking on into bacteriology, for example, it became important because to help sort of put classification or class certain areas of disease, or link certain areas of microorganisms, for example, to particular disease and diagnosis and treatment of human diseases. This in the 19th century there was actually quite a sort of a robust sort of approach, and the link was very it was not just very connected on the one side, but it was also it was probably perhaps more collaborative in that time as well. And this is some understanding that's come out of two different publications. One was in Stewart in 2008, and Pitt and Cunningham in 2009. Stewart's work is a paper publication, and Pitt and Cunningham is a book publication. And so during the 19th century, significant links developed. Between areas pertaining to science and medicine, and the sites specializing in sort of experimental experimentation of certain areas of health and healthcare and science took place mainly through laboratory practices. So on the one hand, at least on the one hand, and then places of healing, i.e. in for example hospitals and in sort of dispensaries, and public health and sort of public health sort of departments also on the other. That being said, though, dual effort has dual effort from those practicing in areas of science and medicine. There was perhaps more mutual respect for each other in earlier areas of health and medicine, at least to the point where people did not feel sort of isolated in areas of their practice, and they had more of a there was more sense of ownership of what they practiced. So, for example, if it was something in science, someone who was doing something in medicine would get understanding from those in the sciences, and vice versa from the sciences in aspects of medicine. And that's and not to say that doesn't happen now. Of course, it does happen, but it's where basically scientists have sort of the underpinnings in aspects of their training quite early on around aspects of health and medicine, and there can be sort of an overlap in ascertaining or obtaining particular knowledge according to inquiry, and for medicine, those who are medics or clinicians, though they are primarily frontline health professionals, for example, they also see themselves automatically as scientists, and actually that's not necessarily true. You only have to look at things that have been happening around, for example, COVID-19 and the pandemic, and where understanding around the particular issues around COVID-19 and the pandemic is where clinicians seek to identify areas of practice with the support and understanding of scientists and those practicing in of how or have a focus in laboratories, for example. So there has been a sense of in one way or another stepping on toes. To use a phrase that everyone should hopefully be familiar with. It's also important, though, however, dual effort has paved the way to scientific diagnostics and made impact to fashion modern medicine and areas of modern healthcare. It is only after a beginning of, for example, the antibiotic era in the late 1940s and early 1950s, just some additional understanding around this is that the National Health Service in the UK actually was sort of founded just after in the 1940s, and that and the antibiotic era, and when things were sort of developing around areas of science and healthcare, the decisive improvements in the control of for example, what was referred to as the White Plague could be attributed to the conjunction of chemical and bacteriological efforts conducted both in areas of laboratory practice and in academia. So with when so in that time there was a similar scenario in one regard, at least, where where there was an epidemic of some kind. And if we look at the way healthcare looks to approach focuses around ensuring there's patient safeties, and patients are receiving the appropriate healthcare and treatments. Science has that link with evidence-based and academia and laboratory practice more so than for example doctors and clinicians, and their readings and part of their training has focused around that. And obviously there are different kinds of scientists, and there's obviously different kinds of sort of clinicians as well. The fate of biomedicine as a sort of a word is a marker of the specific and yet parallel changes that affect the relationship between science, medicine, and public health, at least in Britain and in parts of Europe. For example, in France, the prominence acquired by that term biomedicine between 1945 and 1975 coincided with the appearance of a new system of medical sort of innovation in relation to biology and health policy. More around that can be identified again in Stewart's paper in 2008, and some context around that in Pitt and Cunningham's book in 2009, and some works by some of that context has also in Shergold and Grant in 2008. However, that being said, at least where biomedicine is concerned, the system was far from homogeneous, and that meant the meaning of biomedicine was deeply influenced by the different scientific and national cultures that shaped Western medicine since at least the late 19th century. And in Britain, for example, the word biomedicine first appeared in actually, I'm not sure if listeners are aware of this, but there's I even had a copy of this myself. It's Dorland's sort of medical dictionary. It's a huge dictionary, like much more that presents itself more like an encyclopedia, Dorland's has gone through quite a few editions over time, but the word biomedicine was actually in one of Dorland's earlier editions, actually dating back all the way to 1923. Medical diction, and basically then after sort of the underpinnings were sort of in a way interrogated and sort of investigated a bit further, it meant that clinical medicine, based on the principles clinical medicine, then as opposed to, for example, aspects of biomedicine, clinical medicine sort of then focused on the principles of physiology and aspects of biochemistry. There's some other there's some resources that listeners can check out, not least again with works by Stewart 2008 and Pitt and Cunningham in 2009. There is a paper publication which looks at sort of the sort of archetypes between the professionals, professionalism in health, in healthcare, between frontline and frontline medical professionals, frontline health professionals versus those sort of healthcare professionals traditionally who practice behind the scenes. And so during 1945 to 1975, where biomedicine was concerned, that then became biomedical, and so in the UK, there is, for example, an organisation or a professional body that actually links to areas of healthcare and sciences, that's referred to as, for example, there's the Institute of Biomedical Sciences, or IBMS, and also there is the two other sort of known professional organizations. One is also referred to as the Association of Clinical Biochemistry, and the other one is also the Royal College of Pathology. However, that being said, the work of areas of the sciences, it can at least during that time point, 1945 to 1975, consisted in establishing several research focuses, mostly within London teaching hospitals, where it prompted a distinct research style inspired by what was referred to as the Cambridge School of Physiology, and the making of the British clinical with the aim, of making a British clinical medicine sort of open quote, close quote, sort of more scientific, just to emphasize or elaborate on this particular point, and that is that medics or frontline staff, clinicians, as I mentioned, they're not scientists. They have to train additionally to actually get a grasp on scientific language themselves. It is why aspects of, for example, around COVID-19, the pandemic, and things around the focuses around the guidance, COVID-19 guidances and restrictions. There are certain terminologies that frontline professionals have to impart with their patients, or those whose care they oversee, and those areas of healthcare have been, at least where long-term conditions are concerned, have constantly been causing pretty much nothing but a confusion, and to not sound too off, the way that the sort of guidances and the restrictions around COVID-19 exist, or sort of coexist with the actual pandemic. It's a pandemic in itself, with just the kinds of updates that such professionals, health professionals, might have to sort of adhere by, or kind of get to a grasp around. So by contrast, at least in the French context, the word biomedicine appeared only in the 1960s, at least more so, when it was used mainly by science policy makers and sort of state administrators. The most striking similarity, considering the strength of British, the sort of British tradition, and areas and focuses around public health medicine, was the sort of, it was actually more around the redefinition or redefining, like what is, for example, public health. And so it was, I mean, in the way that I've read got the understanding and read the literature, is probably pretty much like a bit of a coin toss between having public health as being related or assigned to aspects of hospital healthcare in some way, and or a focus around drug-based healthcare, or in other words, as sort of a curative rather than preventive medicine. And really, public health itself has various archetypes and sort of divisions, and so it's not a particular a focus that I want to draw in on today, but I suffice to say that public health, it kind of links with really all aspects of healthcare in one way or another, and make no mistake that is basically what public health should be about. But as to how is it how specific it is it essentially around hospital healthcare, or is it around, for example, drugs and sort of the pharmaceutical aspects, and when we draw on understanding around public health, at least in today's sort of world, we can see that public health has a focus across lots of different sort of spheres in science and medicine as well. So and that context is sort of highlighted in a paper by Abbott 1998 and Abbott in 1990. However, the creation of when the sort of NHS came to came into effect, it's also been sort of problematic for those with aspirations to form to a form of healthcare or medicine that considers the environment and the way it sort of integrates itself with other aspects of general life, and that is to say that where however the NHS has focused itself, and obviously in 70 plus years, or just over 70 years that it's been established, there's been different approaches as to how it is relatable or interconnects really with individuals, if not individuals, environment and places perhaps more prominence around prevention rather than cure, and thus overall seeks to deal with health in an again in an integrated sort of manner rather than a molecular manner. So what this means is that what the NHS is and has been about is where if it was, for example, molecular focused, then everyone would for example just have aspects of the science around their in their, for example, in their healthcare notes, for example, and not so much the sort of the medicine or the clinical medicine aspects. So when someone when looking back at how the sort of NHS sort of found itself, or how it was, founded by Anna and Bevan in the 1940s, late 1940s, then it's perhaps no wonder why that even before then there was potential disruptions or disrepute in how healthcare should overall be perceived, and whether it should be more clinical, whether it should be more scientific, and the terminology is related to, for example, biomedicine versus biomedical, or for example, clinical medicine versus biomedicine, etc., etc. So I now want to talk, highlight, at least talk a little bit about interprofessional working. So the healthcare sciences, and where, at least where that's concerned, encourages actually sort of a more a closer link in some regard, at least, that different allied health professionals, or those in different allied health professional groups, can have a sort of a more constructive dialogue with multidisciplinary colleagues, so based on the sort of requests that they make. So for example, if I throw out the example here, when is it safe to sort of transfuse patients who might need a blood transfusion, and if they do need a blood transfusion, apart from that, to see and assess, for example, if there's renal insufficiency, or if those patients are at risk of acute kidney injury. Now, primarily, that sort of request is mainly and would be done by a clinician. It may be done by a sort of a registrar who is a senior clinician. It might be done by a consultant on the front line. It depends on the case scenario, but also after, for example, whether a transfusion goes ahead or not, that the link or the communicative aspects of that request are in the main dealt by sort of healthcare, for example, healthcare scientists in the background, but or behind the scenes, but at the same time, by the sort of link that clinicians on the front line have with other allied healthcare professionals, or with the multidisciplinary team, depending on what a patient and why they might need a transfusion, for example, a blood transfusion, apart from perhaps the obvious, for example, their hemoglobin level is low, and they might need a transfusion for that primarily. Apart from that, there might be other aspects of that patient or that individual, the patient, that other health professionals are more aligned to providing support. And that's not to say that that does not happen, but it does not happen in unison. There's basically different regions practice differently, and some, for example, where understanding is around, apart from that main request, for example, more often than not, it's the clinician that pretty much does has a role or focus throughout the patient's care, and those other health professionals, whilst there is availability of them, and based on maybe, for example, a patient develops a sort of a complication in one way or another, and clinicians don't, for example, are not, for example, they don't have the expertise around that a particular complication. Another allied health professional might do. So it's about really having an approach where there is a link between health professionals through multidisciplinary working and collaborative working in that way, and obviously interprofessional working as well. So in this way, leadership is developed as well. Allied health professionals are really, whilst there are some examples of at least a good level of practice around leadership across different allied health professionals, different health professionals apart from frontline clinicians. It's also for such health professionals, those kinds of health professionals, it's knowing when a patient may benefit from alternative treatment or care pathways, and there needs to be sort of perhaps in the literature at least, there's not really much out there to highlight alternative forms of treatment or practice. In this case, for example, the multidisciplinary team, if they're effective and they're collaborative, they can preempt, for example, someone needing or requiring a transfusion. So, for example, for someone who might have, who might look like they might need a transfusion, they can potentially sought understanding for example, from either scientists, and maybe pharmacists or something, or those kinds of professionals, for example, to see if the patient might benefit from having EPO, or which is sort of referred to as erythropoietin, which is a subcutaneous sort of injection that the patient can have and is administered subcutaneously, which then actually helps stimulate red cells, and that can actually help potentially with decent red cell turnover, at least until there's potentially an episode where where it might look more probable that they would need a transfusion. And of course, with that, there may be a reason, sort of a link where a patient might need an iron infusion to help with that as well. Colleagues, health professionals, can gain first-hand experience of what works and what doesn't, and there is a need for sort of those sort of where at least where interprofessional working and efforts around different areas of healthcare practices are concerned. There's a requirement for sort of good leaders to link areas of standard operating procedures to and encourage evidence-based practices or learning and development in practices, so that actually for example, clinicians and healthcare scientists or scientists and other allied health professionals are on the sort of same level playing field in delivering different aspects of healthcare to the patient. And now there is a more online and remote aspects of healthcare that should present opportunities, but we're still not as far as sort of mainstream healthcare practices are concerned, we're still not there yet. So retrospectively, an example of where leadership is required, and at least around the focus around that long-term condition I mentioned, being chronic kidney disease, and the science and the areas around clinical practice as well, or clinical medicine, early screening, for example, from professionals, those who look to provide understanding around that, that from an evidence point of view, it needs to come out into the public domain, so that the public sort of understand and know that for example, literature that is around a particular issue has been substantiated with appropriate references and resource. That context comes out from work by some work from Pitt and Cunningham in 2009, Barnett and that team in 2012, Aitken and team in 2014, and Avenkar in more retrospectively in 2004. This now then brings me on to interprofessional working and collaborations. Interprofessional collaborations more, and then I then will highlight some context around professional integration. So with regards to interprofessional collaborations, there is a traditional sense that allied health professionals have been involved in the support of healthcare teams providing validation and authorization of specific areas of practice, and as part of and perhaps more part of secondary care in the hospital setting, perhaps, versus primary care. There are variations depending on, again, on the region in the UK, but generally speaking, there are definitely some variations and some understanding around at least some focuses around pathology and pathology practice has been highlighted in a document known as Pathology Networking in England 2019. So whilst I don't really want to delve into areas of economics, listeners would probably get a feel for a feel that that there is sort of those sort of a light economic undertone in some of this, but I don't really want to focus on that. Only to say that anything to do with economics, it causes sort of unknown dynamics in areas of equality and equity. But at least we should know that smarter working initiatives or interprofessional collaborations should allow better or smarter care for patients in between healthcare sectors. At present, or at least for some time, the evidence base for collaborative interprofessional working or collaborative working and where allied health professionals, different allied health professionals, and where they are physically involved, for example, in areas of primary care versus secondary care, it's again, it's very there is variation, and there is I may have mentioned this before in one of the previous audios and podcasts about the primary around primary care networks, or PCNs, but generally speaking, the focus around PCNs is non-existent, and where there was a little bit of understanding around, for example, focuses around terminologies, science, biomedicine and clinical medicine, for example. Biomedicine, when someone says biomedicine, for example, that relates to perhaps the sciences, healthcare sciences, and clinical medicine. People would know, generally speaking, that or should know at least, that relates to frontline healthcare professionals. So, but as far as biomedicine, if that word terminology can be used, and where sciences is concerned, it's largely it's a focus in healthcare that remains unchanged. It still remains hidden. It still remains in even with regard to the professional organizations or the professional bodies that the scientists themselves sort of are aligned to. Generally speaking, remain not just hidden, they remain silent, and also unchanged, and cross-professional, interprofessional working, or cross-professional collaborative working is fragmented, and if it's not fragmented, then it's definitely segregated, and so this then brings things more into the sort of 21st century, now, so the now and today, for example, and sort of linking a little bit to what I've said in part of the introduction, where there are those online spaces, and even through social media, and different sort of websites or sort of websites and web portals, for example, they sort of help individuals, in patients and maybe carers, in lots of in different ways. Whilst websites, for example, provide patients with information, for example, around let's say an area of, again, I think I've used a similar example before in another audio, for example, around physiotherapy, or around I don't know, for example, ophthalmology, or something around, even around dentistry, for example. They are being sort of requested or highlighted or invited by a healthcare provider, in the main as well. So patients, again, are naturally have their own susceptibilities and vulnerabilities that they will sort of revert back to going to one of the lead, one of for example, a general practitioner or a clinician in secondary care, for example. So, and that's obviously, there's nothing wrong with that, and there should, I want to highlight that the perspective should be on this is that there's nothing there's patients generally have to or should go back to their health professionals, in whether in a general practitioner or a clinician in secondary care, for example, and depending on what the situation is, after seeing, for example, those allied health professionals, or other sort of frontline health professionals, such as the dentist. They should also be able to as part of their understanding what happens, should be able to gain confidence, and confidence is easily lost in aspects of today's healthcare. And the climate really for different allied health professionals, kind of to sort of intercollaborate, and also interprofessionally immerse themselves in more smarter ways of working. That sort of comes part and parcel with what we all are sort of familiar with now, where I would at least think that most people would be doing like online or video calls, etc. And so that does present opportunity for people to collaborate who wouldn't necessarily collaborate in any way in a traditional sense, and if not from a practice perspective, a healthcare practice perspective, at least from evidencing aspects of healthcare by looking at topics or areas of healthcare that need more integration, as far as evidence needs to be put forward to support clinicians and doctors who deliver frontline practice. So this then means that generally having that novelty, novelty and working in a collaborative effort and way in that context, then that actually brings healthcare for patients in around past best practice, and aspiring for excellence in practice. Then owing to sort of for example, point of care testing, or POCT, or which also used to be referred to as near patient testing, or NPT. This could also prompt allied health professionals to be more active in more proactive, in community, in areas of community and environments that they would not necessarily see themselves have a role in or have a focus around, and that could help advance advance areas of screening and monitoring suspect or high-risk patients for different kinds of conditions, and not least, for example, chronic kidney disease, and also with that, it must be elaborated that where point of care testing or near patient testing, whichever is more familiar, there should be a link with educational understanding as part of an area of practice, so that screening or sort of screening or monitoring, so that the patient actually then has imparted knowledge base and an understanding from that very professional, and that then should bring more quality and increase areas of safety, so that more again, where best practice becomes more about excellence in practice. I now finally want to just talk and briefly go over an understanding around professional integration. Now, though what I've talked about already does sort of pinpoint around areas of professional integration, but the focus I want to highlight is about the sort of the involvement aspect, really, between different groups of health professionals, and how different steps of what health professionals do can be contribute to their professional development, but also aligns to aspects of their the kind of quality assurance that is part and parcel of their day-to-day practices. So it has been highlighted in several papers, actually, that relating to the care of the care of patients with long-term conditions like CKD, again, on this focus around professional integration. More definitions are in certain papers. There's a paper publication by Park and team in 2019, and some works by Abel and that team in 2020. So where there is a sort of a gap in healthcare and professional integration, is actually the involvement of allied health professionals, and basically where professional integration should be inclusive and should be diverse, perhaps at least in a broad and nonsensical way, so that every aspect of the patient who are going through a particular healthcare issue or even crises, they can have access to these different professionals, and they all have place. And where when, if that is achieved or is achievable, then that brings a sense of apart from inclusivity and diversity, it actually brings a more involved and more timely care to the patients who require that form of a particular health issue or concern, so as to the point where they don't they should not feel compromised. Modern healthcare is delivered sort of by teams rather than individuals, and requires momentum of healthcare professionals from various disciplines, and yes, it's delivered by teams, but teams also have, for example, you could have, I forget, for all intents and purposes, I'll give the example of physiotherapy. You can have a therapy team in one part of region of the UK, and an area of practice that they relate to a patient with a particular scenario, for example, broken leg, for example, or broken neck, or something in the bones that don't that should connect but they don't connect, for example. But the sort of procedure around that is not in unison from one region to another. So what one region practice in an area of physiotherapy, for example, should be the same elsewhere, and vice versa. And I'm not saying, for example, that is everywhere, for example, in the UK, but given that physiotherapists and other allied health professionals, they all practice under a particular professional body, or they're at least registered professionals under a particular professional body according to what they're doing, it should make sense that whatever they do in one region is the same as in another region, and vice versa, and the professional body that they're registered under, they should sort of assure that, so that if, for example, an area of practice cannot be fulfilled in one part of the region, patient can go to another region and, for example, get exactly the same thing, but and actually it would be not just the same. There's just general that there would be continuity. Now, apart from that, it is understood that failures in professional integration and teamwork could lead directly to compromised patient care and inefficiencies, and that's what I'm alluding to here. Understanding around that has been highlighted in Park and team in 2019, Chaplin and team in 2020, and Abel and team in 2020. Professional integration is as much about smarter working as it is about professionals developing best practice, or I would like to think excellence in practice. There are multiple interfaces and things that people work by, at least in today's day and age. For example, and I'm not one to promote anything in any way, but where professionals generally, whether frontline professionals or sort of allied health professionals are concerned, everyone has seemed to in some way lost the very basis of what they should have integral as part of their practice, and that is to implement areas of education alongside with aspects of the practice that they deliver, and that then which should bring safe and effective practice as well. Finally, I just want to say here, patients with long-term condition who seek sort of more background and understanding relating to health healthcare and healthcare, and want to see themselves have ownership and take ownership. Sort of online spaces, online consultations, and all of the things that are quite familiar, should be generally familiar now. There is opportunity for that. The renal patient support group of the RPSG, which I have mentioned before, delve into aspects of kidney care practice, nephrology, across mainly around adult nephrology, but they do have a pediatric sort of a focus with in a collaborative effort, working with the kidney disease and renal support group for kids, or KDARS for kids. And whilst these are primarily social media platforms, there's 10,000, as far as I'm aware, there's 10,000 members or patients between the two social media platforms, or over 10,000 members. And whilst that might not seem like a particularly large population, it is an online population that where patients and even carers seek to identify more understanding from the health professionals that should be implementing and conducting themselves to the point where they should impart some of that knowledge base, and so that whatever is highlighted and put into perspective through there can actually be put part of the patient's electronic patient record or electronic health record, and the RPSG does have, for example, having checked it out myself, has a couple of YouTube channels which highlight educational support, as well as audios around different subject entities pertaining to nephrology practice, and areas of health care science as well. So it's evidenced a good body of research as well, and has been looking to meet in line with if not excellence in practice, then at least best practice. There are, for example, multidisciplinary or allied health professional webinars that are on the across the social media, and they were one of the, as far as I know, at least where kidney care practice is concerned, they were one of the main sort of organizations dating back over 2000, since 2009, so over a decade, where they were implementing these in relating to point of care education, and listeners are more than welcome to check out their website as well, but also one important point is making sure that really allied health professionals and interprofessional collaborations are seen across different areas of healthcare, and the long-term condition chronic kidney disease sort of lends itself quite well to that, because it has lots of areas that of, for example, physiology, and even areas across biochemistry, for example, that are really quite multifaceted and require collaborative efforts early on in the disease trajectory. So it's important that those sort of examples are kind of known, or should be can be referred to. Apart from that, I finally want to just say that online, so whether working face to face or online, multidisciplinary team consultations, or even multidisciplinary educational sessions, or face to face or online, that is where actually allied health professionals can see themselves of having a sense of having a sense of integrated focus, and that can ultimately prompt, or should prompt, or could prompt an additional sort of layer to patient care, and could be more advantageous in patients with, for example, multi-morbidities. I'm going to leave it at that. I hope everyone has enjoyed listening to this. I hope that apart from listening, that it offers opportunities to kind of prompt your own questions about your aspects of healthcare that you people should be receiving but not receiving, etc., etc., etc. This has been this is the Shientist. It's another audio and podcast under the LabZtorm effect, and this was on interprofessional collaborations, and it's been another Storm Lobostics production. Thank you for listening.